Some kids' films, they still have to fight and kick them in the balls and all that kind of stuff. This one, not so much ball kicking.
I said it before and I'll say it again. Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Never fear change. Life is too short for fear. Chase what is desired.
I can do this all day.
Would you mind identifying what you are?
We're the best friends squad.
That's what we call ourselves. Sort of like a team.
Welcome to the rodeo. Ladies and gentlemen, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride.
This is the way.
I have spoken.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fantasy Show at the movies.
Don't bore people. Don't worry too much about replicating someone else's formula. Be original with the way you podcast. James Schramko, Australian.
I'm Sean.
I'm Jen.
And today on the Skiffy and Fantasy Show, we're being super original by talking very strangely. Super original, Jen.
Super original.
We're apparently talking about a movie called A Wrinkle in Time.
Because time has wrinkles.
That seems totally accurate to how physics works, yeah. It is a film directed by Ava DuVernay.
Hey, you know what? Put some respect on that name.
I'm sorry.
And then go back to the beginning. This is just respect.
It is a film directed by Ava DuVernay in an adaptation of Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, which should be obvious from the title of the movie, A Wrinkle in Time. But just in case you didn't know, it's an adaptation of a book with the same title.
Yeah, because it's possible that not everybody is our age, and therefore did not read A Wrinkle in Time.
Yeah.
Although I think it's actually still being assigned in like 6th grade for book reports, so who knows?
Well, I will tell you this, Jen. We're done with the voices, by the way.
Thank goodness. I appreciate that.
I just wanted this to be original, so...
Hey, you know what? I don't know why that quote was just so difficult for you.
I want to stand out, Jen, okay?
I get that. I think we do that already, which is why I use the quote. Plus, you know, it ties into Mrs. Who from A Wrinkle in Time. Get it? Because quotes.
Sure, I get it, Jen. I'm just saying that maybe our listeners need to sit back and just think. Why don't you tweet at us, #OriginalSkiffy, to tell us what do you think is our most original moment in the history of the show?
That would be cool, but I think it should be #OriginalFanty.
Look, you can use both. Anyway, so...
Who do you like more, Skiffy or Fanty? Fanty.
I think we don't need to be a battle over which one. We're both sexy, Jen. It's fine.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay, this is getting very strange, and we need to move back to the subject, which is we're talking about A Wrinkle in Time, Madeleine L'Engle's an adaptation of her.
You've already said that.
Fuck, I'm like totally flustered by you. God damn it! Like, Wishes just got like off the rails. So I'm putting we're gonna do normal from now on. And you're going to have fun editing this.
Okay, first off, you and I do not do normal. We do original.
Fucking hell. Okay.
So I just want to clarify that. Second, you're right. We should get back on topic, which is, you know, the movie Wrinkle in Time. But before we do that, we have some reviews to read to you.
Yep, and I will just note that the only reason we found out these exist is because I got bored and decided I would check in iTunes by switching my region to see what reviews existed for different regions. And that's when I found out that not only does iTunes do this for the UK, where it separates the UK and the US, it also separates it for literally every other country in the entire world. And so if I want to see reviews from some of you who don't live in the United States, I literally have to change my region every single time to every country in the world. And I find that deeply frustrating, and it's annoying, I think, and offensive to all of you who have written reviews, and I've never seen them.
So, speaking of, if you have written a review from a country other than Australia, Ireland, the UK, the United States, Canada, or Germany, please let us know, because we can't see you unless we randomly select your country.
Yeah.
Which, there's a lot of countries in the world, so that might take a while.
I would say that in general, if you are from somewhere outside the US, which is the default for us on iTunes, and you leave a review, just hit us up on Twitter @SkiffyFanty so that we know and we know to look, because there's 200 something countries on iTunes, and that would take us like a week to go through to check.
I literally just said that. Why have you started repeating everything that I said?
You didn't... Okay, fuck right off. I was saying that they should at us if they have done it. Not if just in general they happen to have left a review. If they leave a review in the future, they should contact us immediately so we know to look.
Yes, but then you repeated what I said about there being a lot of countries and that would take us a while.
I hate everything about this podcast now. That's just, like, ridiculous. Like, to just get it...
You're welcome.
Just get it right the first time.
I had it right the first time.
You didn't. You got, like, 1/3 of the way there, and I had to fix it, and then you gave me shit for fixing it.
You did not have to fix... Never mind. Just...
You... 1/3.
You know what?
You're a 1/3.
What? I am 1/3.
You're a 1/3.
Now, could you please read the reviews?
You're just one of the misses. We need all 3 for this to work, Jen.
You know what? I happen to love my faults. They are one of my best features.
Fair enough. I don't know which one of the misses said that, but that's you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's Mrs. Who?
It was Mrs. What's It.
It's Mrs. What's It.
Yep.
Yep. All right.
Yep.
Moving on. So anyway, new reviews. We're going to start with Canada. I'll start with
Woo, woo.
Art Sifton, who left us a review this year. It says, this is a very knowledgeable group of SFF fans who are able to tease out insight into the genre, the fandom community, and into the history of fandom. Whether they're taking a deep dive into an old movie, discussing a trend within the genre, or talking about a new book, this is always fun to listen to. Oh, thank you.
So nice.
No, we're just blushing a little bit. It's okay. It's fine. We're gonna be okay, right, Jen?
Yes, I think we're gonna be okay. Shall I need to read the next review?
Yeah, read the other Canadian.
The other Canadian is Miranda Gem. This show will keep you on your toes. They keep things fresh with loads of different content and switch things up between movie reviews, author interviews, and discussions of current events. Great time.
Aww. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we also have one review from Germany, which we don't know who this is.
I wish we did. They need to tell us.
Yeah, really, I'm curious. Who are you? Who are you, Deseano? Or Decino? However you say it.
Or Deshawn
Oh,
O.
Deshano. That could be it. It could also be like a German word that we don't know how to pronounce because we don't speak German and we're Americans and we're very typical and we don't speak any other languages.
Yeah, that's true.
Which honestly just makes us seem very pathetic right now. But they said, I've been listening to Jen, Sean, Paul, and all the others for 7 years now. The range of topics covered, the diverse skills unveiled, and all things is wonderful. Go have a listen and laugh, learn, and be amazed. Thank you so much. That's so sweet.
Thank you.
That's very nice.
That is so sweet.
Yeah. This is going to get really repetitive where we're just always going, oh.
I mean, we've been doing that for every review we've gotten so far, so I think we need to maintain that so that when we get a bad review, we'll still like, oh, that's so sweet. Thank you. But that's neither here nor there because these were all positive reviews and we love you guys.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thank you. So if you want to leave them, obviously go to iTunes. We'd love to get more reviews. Just as we said before, make sure if you're outside the US, just let us know on Twitter.
Yes, and now let's get to the topic. But first, we asked all of you what your opinion on Ava DuVernay's adaptation of A Wrinkle Time was. Was that grammatically correct? Probably
I think not.
I don't
Maybe
care.
start over.
Moving ahead. So, Juan San Miguel said, I think it is an ambitious book to adapt. When I was in elementary school, it was the book to read. Would you get the book? I think Ava did a good job and worth watching.
I think that's interesting, and we'll probably come back to this a little bit because I read the book, but I don't remember the book because I as I mentioned off podcast to Jen, when I read the book, I felt like I was on drugs, and I still don't know what the book was about. And so Jen, I think, has a better handle on the book, so I think we'll come back to this adaptation question for sure.
A little bit, yes.
And then we got another one by David Steinberg at ZZYZX on Twitter, who said, since a friend retweeted this and I saw it, I'll say once again that I don't see how you can have something calling itself A Wrinkle in Time where Mrs. What's-It hates Meg. That relationship is how Meg was able to stand up to the it, after all.
Yeah, and that is a very interesting, I think, reading of one of the big differences between the book and the movie. So I have opinions on that, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
I think we'll get into it right after we get through first telling us what this movie is actually about, because we haven't talked about it yet, and then giving our general thoughts before we put up that spoiler wall. And since I think you did the last movie, I think that's my job.
That is entirely up to you. Would you like to?
I'm doing it.
Okay, go for it.
A Wrinkle in Time, the film, follows a young black girl named Meg, who, along with her brother, Charles Wallace, and also their friend, Calvin, have to go through a series of sort of magic, sort of science fiction adventure to save their father, played by Chris Pine, Dr. Alexander Murray, from a evil entity in the universe called the It, which is a sort of malevolent darkness that exists in the world. They are joined in this adventure by three astral beings, I guess is what we would call.
Essentially, yeah.
Yeah, Mrs. Witch played by Oprah Winfrey, Mrs. Whatsit played by Reese Witherspoon, and Mrs. Who played by Mindy Kaling, who essentially kind of help guide them on their journey as they become, in the infamous words of Oprah Winfrey in this film, become warriors for the light, as it were.
Aww.
It's kind of a cute little story, and it kind of follows them as they discover their abilities. It's mostly, though, about Meg's discovery of confidence in herself, I would argue, and in the process, also sort of close relationships with family and reuniting family. It's really that simple. That's kind of the basic premise. And then there's just lots of like really beautiful scenery kind of thrown in. But that's the basic idea of the story. And it's really fun.
Yeah. And I do think that this is an absolutely beautiful adaptation of A Wrinkle in Time. Unfortunately, I think that the critics are correct in that there is an over-reliance on making it beautiful, and some of the story, I think, gets lost behind that.
Oh, thank goodness. Okay, so it wasn't just me.
No, it's not just you. This was one of the main criticisms of the film, and it's an absolutely fair criticism. I still ended up really enjoying what Ava DuVernay was giving us, but I don't think she's giving us the same thing necessarily that was in the original book. And we'll talk about those differences once we get past our spoiler wall. But this is also a kids' movie, and I think that is a very important distinction. Unfortunately, it's a kids movie that cost way too much for a kids movie and ultimately just was kind of lacking in certain categories.
Yeah.
And then in others, it did a really beautiful job of doing those other things.
Yeah.
Especially when you're talking Black Girl Magic, which I think that's what Ava DuVernay was trying to do, and I think she does that part really beautifully. I just wish it had been in a package that maybe had been tighter with a better script.
Yeah, I think we're basically on the same page, and I think when we get past the spoiler wall, it's probably going to be very similar arguments about where the flaws in this film are. And I think this is a film where you could tell where the price tag was.
Yes.
And that's not really what you want. I mean, look, I get that it's a kid's film, and so there's always like a little bit more leeway in the kind of the playfulness and the fun and the wonder, and you want that in a lot of really great kids films. Like, I could think as a kid, probably as a kid, I'm gonna enjoy this with every fiber of my being, because there's just some really beautiful, fun scenes, right, where they're like flying in the sky on basically Mrs. Whatsit as a giant leaf creature. Like, those are really cool scenes, but from a narrative perspective, they don't always add to the characters or to the overarching story. And I think my biggest complaint about the film is that the real heart of this story is the family relationship, and that sometimes gets sidelined, and friendship, obviously, but it gets sidelined a bit too much for wonder. And that, for me, that's the part of the film that I found myself a little bit frustrated by, because the things that I think have the most replay value here are actually the really beautiful parental moments, like Meg and her father, whether it's in the beginning or later in the film. It doesn't really matter when.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that. Yeah. Oh, one of the most powerful scenes, I think, in the movie.
So this film really hits me in the feels in those scenes, primarily because I didn't really have a dad. And this is like the most positive dad portrayal I've ever seen in a kid's film. Like, usually dads are like either jerks, they're like in Bambi and mom had to die for him to take over, or like, like sometimes you get positives. I get that. This one is like, this dad is, the worst thing about this dad is that, and this isn't spoiling, he just works too much, which is a common thing you see in a lot of films, especially for kids, where like dad works too much and he kind of has to learn. But he doesn't work so much that he never stops to sort of talk to his kids, right? And like show his kids that he loves them. And that to me was like I wanted more. I wanted more of the dad and the mom. I wanted more of that really positive relationship. I wanted to see more of things we'll talk about a little bit more explicitly, like when certain characters disappear, of like one character having to fill in all of the gaps. Like, I wanted more of that. And I think that the film needed to have these like big, beautiful CG sequences, but I just don't think that they added in the way that they should. And I realize we're probably on the same page and we're kind of talking in generalities. And so that's kind of where I'm at, is I think it's a film that had great potential and fell a little short because it focused in the wrong places.
Yes.
I think we should just put a spoiler wall so that you can talk after this with more specifics.
I think that would work for me because there's not much I can say in response other than yes at this point in time. So, spoiler wall! Okay, spoilers! Let's get down to it. First off, they do find Meg's father, Alex. He does live. And that's a very important thing for you to know. But that's not a guaranteed thing at the beginning of the movie, necessarily. I don't think I ever really worried that he wouldn't be found, but I'm going to leave that to you. Did you ever worry that he wouldn't be found?
As an adult, no, but I think if I was a kid, I probably would.
Right, because there's this disappearance. He just literally disappears from 1 minute to the next, which is very different from the book, and I think there's some things that is more successful about the way that it happens in the book, which is he works for the military, he's a military scientist. He's working on the project with his wife. By the way, Gugu Mbatha Raw is fantastic in this as the mother, which is a very tiny role, unfortunately, but she is also a doctor of physics and works with her husband. In the book, though, he disappears after being sent on some sort of military thing, and then they're just not given any information. So there's much more like what happened to him, how did he disappear, and it's kind of a big thing in the community, but not to the extent that it is in this, where it's very much, it seems like he literally just up and left his family, which is, I can imagine, a very damaging thing for a young child. That sense of abandonment. That sense of abandonment isn't there to that extent in the book. And I think it made for a really successful interpretation of the familial relationships and what Meg and Charles Wallace are going through. I think that was actually a really strong point in its favor, because what we have in the beginning is Meg is she's a troubled kid. She acts out.
She's going through what a lot of kids who has lost one of their parents, not because the parent like died or something, or divorced, but like the parent just disappeared.
Well, even divorce, like imagine if a divorce occurred and the parent is just a jerk and like goes and disappears and like doesn't contact the child. I'm saying this because I just watched Babysitter's Club, and Christy, ostensibly main narrator, her father had left. Like, her parents got divorced, and she has a very difficult time watching everybody around her with father figures.
Yeah, this is what I mean, is that it's not just this simple divorce where the parents are still involved. It's like any version in which one parent has disappeared completely, which is a thing that I have experienced, not at the same age as these characters, but you still have a lot of that same anger.
Exactly.
You're a kid, like you don't know how to interpret what's going on, right, when one of your parents disappears, and all the adults don't necessarily say all of the right things. And in this film, sometimes the adults say all the wrong things and don't pay attention to the people that are around them. And we learn that's a little bit, somewhat of the it is kind of involved in all of this. But like, I think one of the most brilliant scenes is when is it the principal and one of the teachers?
No, it's two of the teachers.
Two of the teachers basically spreading, kind of rumor gasping about, Meg is like, she had potential and now she's just like, she's so terrible because she's all messed up, and like Charles Wallace, he's brilliant, but he's weird, and like all of this stuff.
And then making up stories more specifically about why their father left. I bet it was for a woman, these things that are really, really damaging for a child to hear. And adults very often do not realize how much children hear in their discussions.
Right.
So yeah, I totally agree. Charles Wallace overhearing that was a brilliant sort of, and this is Charles Wallace is a very precocious child.
Very
Incredibly precocious. And they call him odd. This was actually one of my, I think, main problems with the movie version of Charles Wallace versus the book. In this, he's only precocious and slightly more intelligent than a child of his age, because he's like 6.
Right.
In the book, it is clear he is like a super freaking genius.
Yeah, it's one of those things where maybe we like just a little bit of visual to show us his genius. Like maybe he's solving really complex math equations or something, or he's figuring things out that adults are struggling with.
Yes.
It's really an easy thing I think they could have sold. But I do think the precociousness comes across.
Oh, very much.
I think it's really important that that's who we see in Charles Wallace, because at the end of this film, when he is manipulated, turned, embodied, possessed by the It, and he becomes this really cruel, mean, vindictive version of Charles Wallace, I think that's really good as a contrast, because at the beginning, right, he is, to a fault, so supportive of Meg. Right, he's like, you have so much potential, and you're weird looking, but also you have a lot of potential. And it's like, he means well, right?
Oh, that scene. It really is. Like, as Sean said, that scene just sets everything up. The relationship between two of them, like, what they're going through, it sets everything up perfectly for what happens.
Yeah, for when we get to him as being this cruel kid who knows all the knives to dig in, and he's digging them all in.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting, because what they kind of did is that instead of making him brilliant in terms of science or something, they made him brilliant in terms of how he deals with people and his empathy and his understanding. And that did work, I think, really well in terms of like the daggers that he does start digging in at the end.
They're really harsh at the end.
Yeah, and you can see that sort of that love of like everybody around him and that belief in the people around him very early on. So that's one of the things that actually translated really well. As much as I would have liked, like the brilliant 6-year-old from the book, I think they took it a different direction that also worked really well for me. And they gave some of that brilliance back over to Meg, in that she was the one solving this physics problems, and she was the one that was super interested in her dad's work and all of these, little details of what is happening, because that's not what happens from my memory of the book. She is not very scientifically oriented. She's an outcast, but for totally different reasons. And the book, much more than the film, has an issue of nonconformity. It's dealing with, like, don't conform. Like the It and Camazotz. You see it in that scene with the houses. Creepiest scene ever. I was totally there with Charles Wallace when all of the kids are bouncing the rubber balls at exactly the same time. That hurt physically. It was physically uncomfortable to listen to those balls. But that was an aspect from the book of this idea that Camazotz and the It were destroying individuality.
Yeah.
And that's part of how it controls people.
And we get that a bit here.
To an extent, yeah.
I think it'd be nice to have a bit more of that, because we get... I mean, I imagine as a kid, maybe the sinisterness is pretty apparent on like why that scene in that suburban neighborhood with all the kids bouncing their balls. I think that's pretty sinister sounding, and maybe as a kid it works. I think as an adult, I would just love a little bit more.
Yeah, no, I think even as a child, I'm not sure it comes across as the It working through conformity.
It's scraping the surface, and there's just more there.
Exactly. Instead of spending 15 odd minutes on that wall scene, which granted looked cool.
I did not like that scene. Just mostly because so much of this film, that when it violates physics, it violates it in ways that don't have clear physical problems for the characters. Yeah, right. Whereas that one's like, let's go inside an old tree and get thrown in the air at ridiculously high speeds. And I'm like, no.
That's going to hurt on the other side.
You're going to be having a bad day. That is a migraine and a half.
Yeah, and again, there's that reliance on the imagery, the wow factor versus the story. And I think that's one of the areas that really shows that sacrifice of the story and the characters for the budget.
Yeah, and it's I think a bit frustrating for me because, if we were dealing with lots of practical effects, they couldn't do nearly the things that they did in this because it just fit largely impossible. With they could do some things that kind of do some trickery with the flying around on Mrs. What's-It as a giant leaf creature, but there's limits to what you can do with the practical effects. But because they went with CG effects, I think over time those scenes that are very CG heavy just start to age. Like, even now, several years after the fact, like the Mrs. What's-It scene is cool. It adds basically nothing to the story. And I'm already looking at it and going like, yeah, it looks kind of like a video game, which is fun if this was a video game, but it's not, right? Like, I'm not playing Zelda right now. If I was playing Zelda and flying around on a giant What's-It leaf creature, that would be the most fun right now. I would have so much fun, but all I'm doing is watching them look at us fly in the sky, and it's super obviously CG, and I'm not getting anything out of this.
No, and that's the biggest problem with this as a film. And like the whole balance scene with Happy Medium.
I wanted more Zach Galifianakis. He's shockingly good.
Oh, he was so good. He was so delightful. And their connection with each other and just how loving he was. Oh my god, I was just it was so nice.
So like this is the thing. Zach Galifianakis, this is the role for Zach Galifianakis, because at the start, right, he's just weird and eccentric, which is Zach Galifianakis, right? This is kind of who his whole comedy persona is. And so he's been this way in everything that he's done in film pretty much. But then it gets past that. It's like, I'm not just an eccentric kind of hippie guy that lives on Orion and like I make everybody balance for reasons, right? It's then also like I'm this deeply loving character and I have all these deep emotions. And there's a moment when like you could see him almost crying.
Oh,
like
yeah.
He's feeling so much. And I was like, that was not what I expected from Zach Galifianakis at all.
It really wasn't. But again, there's a scene where the focus on the balancing, because it was more about the CG than it was about what the characters were doing. And it's a very slow scene. This movie definitely suffers from pacing issues in a big way.
It does.
And that was one of the most glaringly obvious places where that pacing just was not working for me. So you're getting these beautiful moments between Zach Galifianakis and Meg, but it's ruined almost by this attention to the balancing. That could have been truncated so heavily. And they ended up standing on like a solid rock in the end anyway. So it's like, why? What was the point of that scene? And I think the translation is what suffered. The translation from the book to the screenplay, and then to Ava DuVernay's vision of that screenplay versus Disney's vision of that screenplay.
Yeah.
So I think there were like multiple levels of failure here, and that's a big problem. I don't think to an extent it seemed like Disney didn't trust DuVernay's vision.
No, I don't get that impression. Yeah.
Because if you look at where Meg starts, and the fact that Calvin, the thing that he loves about her, one of the first things that it's not the only thing he loves about her, but the first thing that he just like expresses just so purely was how much he loved her hair. Because you have to remember, this is a black girl. This is a 13-year-old black girl who is failing in school because she's being called stubborn and untractable, belligerent, uncooperative. She's smart, but nobody is dealing with the fact that she's gone through these traumas. They're ignoring those in favor of a quick fix of your problem, and that's all we're going to see in you.
And we're going to come back to this in a hot minute when you're done with this, because there's another element I want to talk about.
And those are things that little black girls are dealing with in this country all the time. Like, that is a main issue of when you look at the punishment rates of black children in schools versus white children. So Meg is very much this microcosm. She's this representative of the black experience in schools. And yet she still is this creature who is loved and is amazing with all of those quote unquote faults, which is like that gift from Mrs. What's-It. Later on in the movie, if you remember the book or have watched the movie, obviously, they're given 3 gifts. One is actually like a tool, but I think it reveals things.
It's like special glasses, basically.
Special glasses. The second gift is from Mrs. Whatsit, who says, I give you your faults, which is such an amazing directive, because there's Meg going, those are my worst traits. And Mrs. Whatsit is like, are they though?
Are they? Are you sure?
Are they? Sure?
It's cute.
And it ends up, those are her strengths. And that's such a powerful message. Exactly when you're talking about how Black girls are represented versus how this movie is presenting them. Ugh. It is so tragic to me that this movie ended up failing, because I think that is so important. How often do we see that in cinema?
We don't get it very often, obviously, but I think the problem here is when they sat down to make this film, and I don't know the exact process that went into it, right? When Ava DuVernay came on or whatever, but basically when they sat down and said, we're going to do an actual theatrical release adaptation in post-2010 America, and then they said, we want to have Ava DuVernay on there. What they didn't sit down and say, what are the core themes and issues we want this film to address for our intended audience, which is primarily children, and then said, anything that does not serve those interests, we cut. And we only focus on the things that serve. They don't have to do it like in very explicit senses. They could do it in some sort of very loose senses, just for the fun aspects. But there's just a lot in here that, like, the things that matter at the beginning are very truncated into like 15 minutes of film.
Let's look at what happens to Calvin, right? They're like, you're here for the diplomacy. And
when do we see diplomacy? Like,
never.
There's one moment when he gets yelled at by Charles Wallace, who's like, oh, you're just being so nice, and you're trying to find all of the nice things to say. And Calvin's like, brr.
Yeah, never had to use his diplomacy. And it is, like, Calvin's a good character. Calvin is so pure and good.
Yeah, Levi Miller, I think, with the exception of that, the direction he gets is to whisper too much, which I found really frustrating. I think I wanted to enunciate more. For someone who's diplomatic, I expected him to be a bit more present in how he expressed himself. Now, I get what they're going for, because remember that his father is incredibly abusive, right? Vocally, emotionally abusive. He's yelling at him like, you got a B minus, I think he got, or something.
This is pathetic, yeah.
Right, this is pathetic. Awful. You're awful. And so I get that's the thing, is like, Calvin's being told he's good at diplomacy, but we see him in these scenes where it's actually the opposite, right? He is the guy, he's staring at the floor. He doesn't want to stand up to his dad. And so at the end, he says, I'm going to go talk to my dad. And I think that's great. I just want more of Calvin so that we can see, like, oh no, Calvin is actually good at diplomacy. So, like, here's a great scene.
He didn't get to develop.
This is how you show this. This is the thing I wanted to talk about, because the other side of this is bullying, which is a thing you see in lots of kids' movies. And this film tries to address it by showing us why sometimes bullies are bullies, which is that they are hurting inside and they are pushing that hurt onto other people. You're not supposed to do that, but that's sometimes what bullies do. And the main bully here is Veronica Kiley, played by Rowan Blanchard, who we find out is so bullying. And the thing she says to our Meg is things like, I hope you should disappear too, basically. Horrible things.
Horrible.
Really cruel. And we get other things, like she's kind of the cool kid, and so she's like, quote unquote, the pretty kid, and she's cool, and so she can like destroy your reputation and those kinds of things. But it's the big one is like she's also going with the knife, right? But we find out that Veronica, she's effectively got what many teenage girls have, which is heavily implied here that it may be an eating disorder, but at the very least body dysmorphia of some kind, where she is clearly looking at herself and she does not feel comfortable in her body. Now, here's how you bring this together, because I think that's really great. I just would like to see follow through on that. We don't really. At the end, we kind of get that Meg kind of waves at her and they wave, but there's no reconciliation, which I find frustrating. The beginning, you have Calvin, who sees what Veronica's doing and tries to play diplomat at that moment. Somehow, that scene at the very beginning. And then they come back at the end once Meg realizes why Veronica's behaving the way she is. She's been overtaken by It's put this deep doubt and hate of her own self in. And that's something Meg understands, right? Because she also feels those things. And together, her and Calvin kind of go and they meet Veronica on the street or something and they talk. And that's when Veronica realizes, oh, she's not my enemy. Like, she actually kind of understands a little bit. And that becomes part of the resolution. This is one of those things where I think Ava DuVernay had like a vision, And there was probably some studio sense of like, you need to do X, Y, and Z, and it needs to have these elements, even if those have nothing to do with what it is you want to tell. Because I think the elements of what DuVernay's vision are is there, and they're very clear, and they are some of the most potent components of this. And they're evidence of why Disney should just throw her another $150 million and say, make a different one, but we'll let you make the film that you want to make, and then we'll advertise the crap out of it because we need to make our money back. And that's what I want.
Yes, that's actually exactly what I want too, because I just want Ava DuVernay to do all of the things ever. She's brilliant.
She's talented. I think she really is.
She's incredibly, incredibly talented. And this definitely shows a disconnect between all of the different forces that were going into making this film.
Yeah.
And it's a bummer because look at Storm Reed, the actress who played Meg, is so powerful in that role.
The cast is great.
It's been a long time since I've seen a child act to that level of just sheer talent. And the same thing went for most of the cast. Like, this is a good, solid cast when you're talking about especially the Murray family and Calvin. And then obviously Zach Galifianakis was fantastic.
In his 3 minutes on screen.
Right? 3 minutes on screen, and it was an incredibly powerful 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Then you have Michael Pena as Mr. Red, or Red, who's like a representation of it on Camazotz. He's not there long enough to really make an impression, and it was like, okay, you existed. That's cool. So whatever. And honestly, they wasted Mindy Kaling. They wasted Mrs. Pooh in like such a major way. It kind of drove me crazy. And I think they kind of just felt that kids wouldn't understand that she speaks through quotes. Reese was great. Oprah, when she was given moments, was really cool, but they were directed to be like super stiff and unearthly, and this is, I think, one of the spots that Ava DuVernay did not work. But I think a lot of that was, again, the spectacle, because their costumes are not exactly meant to be moved in. They're gorgeous costuming. I mean,
yeah, the costumes are really good. Yeah,
freaking stunning, but they didn't end up working for giving those three actresses, three of the most amazing actresses ever, the ability to really be anything. And that was kind of disappointing because the Misses are such original characters in terms of children's books. I mean, they're one of the most fascinating elements of the original book because they're just so bizarre and so outside the realm of Earth experience. Charles Wallace, like, trusting them implicitly is really, really hard for the other characters to take. And you get a moment of that, but you never really see it. It's hard to see it.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, yeah.
It would have been nice to give them a little bit more free reign and less sort of stiffness, inevitably. They still get some great moments, obviously. Although Mindy Kaling's Mrs. Who ended up not working for me really at all, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think this is one of those situations where I wonder if... Look, I like Oprah Winfrey. I like Reese Witherspoon. I'm not a big fan of Mindy Kaling, but that's not because of this film. That's just... some of the comedy, it doesn't hit me the way I like. But this is one of those things that Mindy Kaling's a comedian. A comedic actor. I don't know if she's an actual comedian. Reese Witherspoon and Oprah are not. So Oprah is not very well known for like off-the-cuff comedic timing, but she is known for off-the-cuff non-comedic timing. Reese Witherspoon, not really known for that. This is where I wonder if maybe the choice might have been like get some people who are professional comedic actors to play and then say, look, here's what the scene's about, and here are the main lines we want, but also like a little bit of improv, a little bit of play in there. And maybe these actresses can do it. I just don't know enough about them as actresses to know that that's a skill that they have. Mindy Kaling, I think, can. I don't know.
I would say that they all three have that ability, and to an extent, I think Reese Witherspoon displayed some of it.
I want more.
I think Mindy Kaling was super hampered by the script and the fact that they gave her... Because this is the thing about Mrs. Who in the book. She's like rambling off a quote a freaking second because she has every quote in the history of ever in her head. So she's not actually that uncommunicative. She's actually quite communicative, but she has to be translated. And Reese Witherspoon's Mrs. What's-It mentions it at one point, like, I'm the translator because I know how to talk and appear like you guys. And you're like, okay, why would that need to be a thing? But they never really go into why that needs to be a thing in the first place. And she only translates Mindy Kaling's Mrs. Who like once. And they were using the most simplistic of quotes. And I think that part of this, the problem, the failing of Mrs. Who, was that they didn't trust kids to understand things. And that wasn't true of the book. The book hands you these things, these quotes, and says, figure out what their meaning is. And you don't really care who is quoting them. That's not the part that matters as a child. What matters is that you're given this sentence that, like, normally would be like, why would anybody say that sentence? But you know that Mrs. Who is communicating, so you want to be able to read it. You want to be able to understand it. It was kind of like when Mrs. What's-It is talking to the flowers, and she says, they're talking in colors, and you're like, oh, that's amazing and so cool. But they don't really display that that's what's happening quite that well, because again, you know, like, I swear they only changed like 2 colors, and it was more about being pretty.
Yeah, it's about the wings going back and forward, it looks like. I mean, maybe there's more detail there, but it's not super visible.
It's not something you could even try to grasp. And I think that's kind of what happened with Mrs. Who. They didn't even let kids try to understand things.
Yeah.
This is always my desire in children's films, is that I wish, especially newer ones, and this is kind of that's really the problem. This is much more a failing of more recent children's films than it is the ones that you and I have talked about in Through the Wardrobe, because so many of the newer films don't trust kids.
It's interesting because I'll admit, I don't have kids, so like I've not been like keeping up with the kids' films in the last ever. Right, like since at least like 2005, when, you know, like I'd watch kids films, but I'm not thinking about it from the perspective of a child anymore, because I'm not a kid and I don't have kids. But it's super interesting that you mentioned that, because you're not wrong that like when I go back in time and we think back to some of the kids films that we rewatched and we've really enjoyed, even though they're flawed and have their problems because of the time that they were in and the kinds of themes that they were exploring, and sometimes those themes are a little racist or sexist, and sometimes not a little, sometimes very much so. The one thing that I think a lot of them do is exactly what you're saying, right? Like they don't tell you all the things you're supposed to get. They expect kids can figure this out, or if they can't figure it out, it's not a thing for kids to figure out because there's a different element the kids are supposed to get and that the adults might. So like the one I think of is like Bedknobs and Broomsticks with the market scene, right? You and I, when we watched that scene, we were going into like the empire themes and really digging deep into that. Now, is that what they intended that to mean? Maybe for adults, but to a 12-year-old, maybe the 12-year-old is a much more simplified version of that, which is like, oh, look at all these people. Like, I'm British. I'm a British 12-year-old. Look at all these cool people hanging out together. The empire's lovely, which is the message we also saw as adults is kind of what they were going. But then we went, but also here's why it's problematic. A 12-year-old's not thinking that necessarily. But it works on those 2 levels because the scene doesn't tell you. It doesn't say, hey, by the way, you're supposed to figure this out. The kids they just figured out by the visual cues.
Yeah.
And maybe, I don't know if all kids' films today are doing this, but it just seems like, especially in this one, there's a tendency to want to tell kids what to think.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, no. Like, the main characters who are kids will figure out some of it on their own, right? Because, of course, they will, right? Or sometimes they'll figure it out, but they won't tell you what they figured out. They'll just take an action. And then the kids have to they have to figure out the causal chain of events that got them from A to Q. And I would like more of that. And I think that if they had not hampered Kaling's performance here by saying you're going to speak 8 lines and they're all going to be very prescribed for you and you're not allowed any sort of play in that arena, I think that makes Mrs. Who far less compelling than the others. Also takes away dynamics. She has very little dynamics here.
Yeah, she does. And she was my favorite character from the book to be perfectly honest.
She's fascinating as a concept, right?
Yeah. So it just occurred to me that the problem I have, in addition to only giving her a few quotes, the quotes they gave her are like, "Hello, fellow kids," quotes. They're all these like modern American references, except for a couple. Obviously,
Like
you
Gandhi.
do get
Yeah.
you get Rumi and Gandhi, I think. But then you also get Lin-Manuel Miranda.
You're right. Hello, fellow kids.
Hello, fellow kids. And Chris Tucker? They give her a Chris Tucker quote. And I'm like, you know what?
Well, that's one
No.
doesn't make any sense because no kid's gonna get that one.
No, because the word, all it is dang, Chris Tucker, American. And you're like, that is one of the worst things I think I've ever heard on a movie, period. Like, what are you even doing? And I have some problems with like who they picked. They decided to quote Churchill, which is a little bit, and granted, like all the original quotes from Mrs. Who in the book, there are quite a few of them that you're like, a little bit problematic, but the book was written in what, like 1967 or something like that. So, okay.
I can kind of understand why they might use famous people who obviously are, like Churchill's a pretty problematic figure, but he's famous. Because I think the idea here is that the context in which the quotes are said is not really what's relevant for their selection.
That's very true. It's just the words.
And I'm fine stealing from Churchill, and
The level of hello, fellow kids is just a bit high. And I think they were obviously they're trying to connect with a modern audience. Okay, fine. But even then,
it's also 2018. Like, some of the ones they went with are like, these, maybe you update these before you film.
Yeah, right?
Because some of them are like, this was maybe 2013.
Right? Who knows? But that, I think, comes across kind of false in the final presentation of Mrs. Who. And it's a bummer because she's a super cool character. And I think I just would have loved to have seen, granted, the misses in the original book are hard to really gel with, even when you're reading. But that's part of Charles Wallace's role in all of this, is that he is the communicator. He's like their conduit to Meg and Calvin to an extent, which is part of the reason he's also ends up as the conduit for the it in the story and in the movie too, to an extent, although I don't think that translates that well. But I would have loved to have not necessarily explored them more, but let them be more them.
I agree.
Because I think they did that with Zach Galifianakis. They let him be him in a really beautiful way.
A little bit, yeah.
I mean, it's a short role, obviously, and it is in the book too. Like, he's not there for very long. He's basically just directing them on their way and making Meg see within herself and that her vision and that she's valid. Like, all of these things are obviously teaching Meg that she's valid and who she is valid, which is really important. But yeah, like, just let them be them. Like, all three of these actresses are incredible actresses, and they were just so hampered somehow.
So there's a couple things you could say about the cast here. One is there's some incredibly talented cast who are underused in terms of their dramatic ability, right? Mindy Kaling is maybe a little bit on the newer side, but regardless of what I personally say, clearly a talented actress, clearly a talented person. They could have let her do more. The same you could say of Oprah Winfrey, who has a very clear role here. She's very Oprah in how she's presented, right? Reese Witherspoon is very much in a particular character for herself, and if you let them roll with it, great, right? And you have other great actors here. Chris Pine, I think, gives, like, I know the guy's got acting chops, but given that most of us in science fiction and fantasy know him from the Star Trek films as Kirk, where he mostly just plays a brash jerk character who likes to sleep with green ladies, which, fair enough. He's equal opportunity. That's nice of him. Here he gets, even though he's not in the films terribly long, he gets some really, really heartwarming and powerful scenes. And acting alongside some child actors who are shockingly good. We've already mentioned Storm Reed, which she's fantastic here.
Oh my god. And this is what I was mentioning earlier. The reunion scene, and I know this is
So
the one you're
good.
talking about. The reunion scene between Storm Reid and Chris Pine is one of the most impactful couple of like minute long moments
It's so good.
that I think I've ever seen. And they're barely like they're not saying anything other than like Dad and Meg and like just the way he touches her face and looks at her. And the same thing happens when he sees his wife.
Yeah. You believe it. You believe what he's giving.
Gugu Mbatha Raw is like when her eyes are just like seeking every pore on his face to make sure that he's real. And those quiet moments were done so well. But like that makes sense given, you know, Ava DuVernay's history.
Yeah.
And like how even things that are gigantic like Selma is really about the quieter moments and how it's individually affecting people.
Yeah.
And this is one of those stories that's what this is about. It's about individuals finding love for each other, support, finding confidence in oneself.
Mm-hmm. They're powerful for kids.
Yeah, super powerful. And that's the thing that's supposed to fix the entire universe.
Yeah, it's an incredibly positive film. The main storyline here, right? Yeah, it's about you know finding your family, but it's also about like the strength in yourself and how that is part of what fixes the universe. That's what fights the darkness in the world. It's not like guns and bullets and things, which, you know, can be useful. It's more about like, no, we defeat it by, you know, having confidence in ourselves and through love and friendship and respect and care and empathy. Those are the things that fight the darkness, that send it packing. And it's a thing that you see in many kids' films, like that those are the things that are really important in a lot of kids' films. Not all of them, but some of them, right? Some kids' films, they still have to fight and kick them in the balls and all that kind of stuff. This one, not so much ball kicking, which thank you. But this film came out in 2018. That's 2 years into the nightmare hellscape that we are living in. And
Yeah.
I don't know what is more powerful of a message to sort of come out on the big screen than the message that this sends to kids. Because right now, like the guy that's in charge of the United States of America has none of these. He is the it, right? He is a representative of the it. He is diabolical in the way that he presents. He has no empathy whatsoever. And to remind kids like, no, you don't fight this by, you know, beating him up. You don't fight him by punching. You don't fight him with, you know, nuclear bombs and all that. No, you fight him by refusing to give in to those baser, horrible instincts, and you love one another and you respect one another. And I know that sounds sappy, right? But like, for God's sake, maybe we need more of it.
That, I think, really wraps up the potential that this film had, that message. And I wish it had been able to deliver it on a broader scale because it's so powerful.
Yeah.
All right. And you, I believe, have one more thing to say?
I think we're both going to agree on this, and I will let you talk about it, and I'll just say it, and I will just say that Derek McCabe as Charles Wallace here is absolutely phenomenal. And for the love of God, Hollywood, hire him in every fucking thing. He's amazing.
How old is he?
He's like 9 or some shit. I don't know.
Oh my God, it's ridiculous.
He was
so
10.
perfect.
He was 10 when this film came out, so he was probably, oh God, yeah, he was probably 9 when this film came out.
Oh, he embodies Charles Wallace, the vision that they had for the Charles Wallace in this movie, perfectly, and is an absolute force to be reckoned with. And I think that's true, like I said, of all the kids. Levi Miller, I'm sorry, if I were a 13-year-old girl, I would have fallen in love with him immediately. Because the way he looks at Meg is just like, oh my God, you love her so much.
He respects her, and it really comes
and
through in the performance.
He respects her. Oh, God.
But Derek McCabe, like, they gave him, like, complicated lines.
Yes.
And he uttered those out like he had been doing this for 50 years.
Yep. Like, and when you look at that compared to, like, the sort of stiffness of Mindy Kaling and Oprah Winfrey, you're like, what happened here that your 8-year-old delivered a better performance?
Yeah.
Something happened. There was a disconnect somewhere there. And I think a lot of that has to do with the script.
Yeah, I think that's fair because he just gets a lot of really good lines.
He gets a lot. He does. It's a meaty part. But at the same time, you're like, but Chris Pine really wasn't given that much. And yet, holy crap, that man can act.
He can. He deserves a lot of credit. This casting in this, like, Ava DuVernay clearly it knows how to get actors to act.
Yeah.
Mostly. There's a couple roles which I just don't think are Ava DuVernay's fault. I think like there's really nothing you could do for Mindy Kaling here. Like the role isn't right. But like Derek McCabe, like I will say this: if you can get a 9, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid to sound as good as some of the best adult actors, you are, in my book, an exceptional director because that is fucking hard. Because kids are not they're just not at the same like developmental level as adults. And so they don't approach acting the same way, right? It's just more difficult. And you give him, like, he's got to, like, talk about quantum physics and shit. And the kid's just like, I have a physics degree, whatever. Like, it's amazing.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's so true.
It's true. Well, in any case, yeah.
Are we ready to the final thoughts and grade?
Yeah, I'll just give my grade because I've talked enough. And that is that I think this is a solid B. And I don't hate it. I don't love it, and that's kind of where I'll leave it.
That's interesting. You were very nice to this movie.
It's not a bad film. I just think that its flaws are bad, but where its good stuff comes in, we've already talked about. That stuff is memorable to me.
Yeah.
And I think that overrides the flaws enough that for me it gets a B.
I am taking that thought into consideration, but I'm going to give it a B- because I don't think that the things that it's memorable for are enough. And like, it just makes me want a movie that is just about the Murray family plus Calvin. And we're just gonna like hang out with them at their house and talk physics, you know, because that would have been super cool. And dad being like best dad and mom being like best mom, and them inviting poor Calvin over for dinner all the time because his dad's a jerk. And Meg being complicated, but also stubborn and wonderful, and Charles Wallace being precocious and empathic and just a beautiful child. Those are the parts that worked fabulously. And then Zach Galifianakis will show up as the happy medium and just like shower them with love and then leave again.
God, he's so good. God.
He was so good! But in the end, there are huge flaws, and maybe we're wrong. Maybe it was Ava DuVernay's fault. I don't know. I sincerely doubt it, though, given the other things that she's directed. So I wish they had trusted her and her vision, and that's what we had inevitably gotten.
Fair. Totally fair. Yeah.
And I think that's it. I think we're done.
We did it. So, as always, if you have any thoughts you'd like to share, or you want to get in touch with us, or you want to support the show, you can do it in a number of places. You can send us an email at
skiffyandfanty@gmail.com.
Twitter at
skiffyandfanty.
Facebook at
facebook.com/skiffyandfanty.
You can also find us on YouTube.
youtube.com/skiffyandfanty.
And always, you can support the show in a number of ways. One is you can leave us reviews on the iTunes. Please do. We love you. And you can also join our Patreon at
patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. Do you notice a trend here?
Yep, it's very easy. And then there are two last things. You can find our website at
skiffyandfanty.com
and our newsletter by Stephen Geigen Miller at
skiffyandfanty.com/newsletter.
And we did it! Woo!
Yay!
Woo! And also you can find me at Sean Duke on the Twitters. And Jen, where can they find you?
At Loop-de-Loo, also on the Twitters.
Excellent. And on that note, I am going to go raise enough funds to hire Derek McCabe to basically teach me physics. So
that's not awkward at all.
No, that's kind of normal, I think, at this point.
Yeah,
but I'm going to
really
make him
weird.
do it while throwing bananas at me.
That's a little awkward.
Yeah, so awkward ending and scene.
Bye.
If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so at patreon.com/SkiffyandFanty. You can also find us on our website, skiffyandfanty.com, and on Twitter at skiffyandfanty. If you'd like to send us an email, you can do so at skiffyandfanty@gmail.com. The music for this episode comes from Sphere by Creo. You can find out more about their music at freemusicarchive.org.